MLAs recently returned to the legislature. We had the throne speech and a bill trying to dissuade protesters from setting up blockades on rail lines and roadways. To chat more about it is the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, also our legislative reporter. Tyler joining me from Edmonton. Tyler, fines for the protesters can be quite severe, and they could also maybe even receive some jail time.
Yeah, that's right. So this is Bill 1 of the new legislative session, and obviously is coming in the context of these rail blockades that we've seen in Ontario, BC. There have been a couple smaller ones in Edmonton and out near Winnipeg as well. So yeah, major fines, $10,000 for protesters, and the possibility of up to 6 months in jail. And as well, there are even larger fines, up to $200,000, I believe, or for organizations, I should say, that are advocating these sorts of acts. Now, what the government says, what the province says, is that these are, further penalties to dissuade protest, and especially in cases where their actions are already illegal. So obviously, we've seen some instances where the police have been reluctant to move in and break up these barricades and whatnot. So that is Bill 1, obviously, sort of telegraphing in a legislative way some of the anger that Jason Kenney has expressed in recent days. And so that's bill number 1. That's the first thing we have to look forward to arguing about.
Tyler, let's talk more about Teck Resources shelving its $20.6 billion mining project in northern Alberta. That's a big hit for our economy, as now billions are lost, and so are 7,000 jobs. The debate is, I guess, economics versus the environment, and Minister Seamus O'Regan is visiting Alberta to talk about it.
That's right. So he's on something of a listening tour right now. He was in Edmonton on Wednesday, met with Sonia Savage, the resources minister. Kind of walked into a bit of a firestorm this week. Now we have to sort of back up a little bit to get the full picture on this. And if you remember back a few weeks, there was a chief who had some concerns about the project, the Frontier Mine, saying that environmental concerns and whatnot hadn't been adequately addressed. Now on Sunday afternoon, the Alberta government comes out and says, "Look, we've just signed an agreement with the two of these groups, and we're good to go." This was one of the last major hurdles. And then, sort of hours later, it came out that Teck had announced it was canceling it. So, as you say, environmental economics. So, some analysts have been saying for a long time that they didn't believe this project was viable. The initial forecast that Teck was using when it was developing the project was for $95 a barrel. Now, we're nowhere near that right now, closer to 50 probably. So that's the economic side of it. And of course, there's the other economic angle to it as well, which is that the oil and gas industry is worth like 11% of Canada's GDP. As you said, lots of jobs. This would have been 260,000 barrels of oil a day. And then there's the environmental part of it, which is happening in this sort of much larger context. And this has to do with the federal government wanting emissions caps and the province sort of going back and forth with them to reach an agreement on it. And the CEO of Teck Resources saying that, look, there's this environmental debate that's going on right now that's really affecting policy and affecting regulatory regimes, and that it's just a bit of it's a bit of a scary environment to invest in right now. So, this one project is in many ways, I think, the victim of a whole pile of different things happening right now, whether that's, global oil prices, pardon me, or, investors getting worried about oil sands investment. I mean, there's a lot happening in this one story.
Now, something the Alberta government did around 50 years ago was to directly invest in our province's energy sector. According to Premier Kenney, we may go down that road again.
Yeah, that was a bit of a shock to many observers, I would say, on Monday when he was giving this sort of pre-throne speech to staff and caucus, and said, Premier Lougheed did this back in the day with the Alberta Energy Company, and the oil sands sort of wouldn't be here without that investment. So what he's sort of proposing is that the government could backstop, could invest in, could prop up sort of slam dunk kind of projects. We're not talking about, wild goose chase projects as far as the premier has suggested. What he's suggesting rather is that there are projects that are important, that are imperative, that are viable, and that are the victim of politics, not economics. So, and I think probably the clearest example where this has happened in the last little while is the federal government purchasing the Trans Mountain Expansion project once Kinder Morgan sort of got cold feet on it. and they stepped in and said, look, this is a viable project. We'll purchase it, give it some stability in the interim. So this is the same idea that Kenney is proposing, which I think came as a little bit of a shock to people who've been watching a guy who is a long-term small c, small government conservative, the former head of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So, it's an interesting little shift for him, I think, driven by the realities of governing and the realities of the economic situation right now.
The UCP also discussed this week working with a new international investment agency to help drum up investment abroad. What is that going to look like?
Yes, indeed. Details are scant on this, but basically that's going to be it. There's going to be an agency that operates in capital markets around the world that's going to try and drum up investment. So Jason Kenney and his ministers have done a lot of legwork in the last little while, getting out there and promoting Alberta as a good place to invest. So this is, I think, just sort of another step in this sort of plan to get investment dollars flowing back into the province.
Also discussed at the legislature this week, Tyler, was a new bill preventing sex offenders from changing their names.
Yeah, so there were a handful of things that were telegraphed in the throne speech, and that's one of them. Now, this came up a little while ago in Ontario, I believe, and Doug Ford had promised a similar thing. So the idea being that if you are a sex offender who has served their time or whatever and gets back out and changes your name, and then if you Google it, I guess the person's original name wouldn't come up. So this is one of the changes the Alberta government wants to make, prevent that from happening, and yeah, so there's a couple sort of little bits and pieces, little nuggets in that throne speech, and that was certainly one of them.
Alberta wants to introduce a recall act, Tyler, whereby you can potentially fire your MLA, mayor, or city councillor. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it goes sort of all the way down. I think school trustees are involved in this as well. I mean, goodness, it could be fun. I believe British Columbia has a similar legislation. Often in the cases elsewhere, though, we're talking MLAs and we're talking, the premier. But this, as you say, goes right down to mayors, goes right down to city councillors. This is very much supposed to be sort of a democratic renewal thing. If you don't like your representative, you should be able to, get rid of them. I think where this could get interesting, could get fun, could get dramatic is to what extent this can be weaponized or used by various special interests to muck around in politics outside of the election period. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this all plays out. And I think people are going to be watching this quite closely.
Could this also potentially set the stage for a referendum on separation?
Well, yes, that's another thing that we saw this week, which is there's going to be legislation that sets out a citizens referendum initiative. And so basically what that means is that any citizen could bring forward a referendum on any subject. Let's say you really wanted a provincial sales tax. Let's say you thought that was the best way out of, Alberta's financial troubles. You could propose that in a referendum and, whatever the process might be, that could come forward. Now, of course, it could be separation as well. As far as we know at this point, the sky is the limit. There have been plenty of jokes on social media about, well, I'm going to propose a referendum that the premier has to wear a pink beach hat for every public announcement. So again, one of those things that we'll have to keep an eye on to see how it plays out. But yes, certainly it could lead in theory to a separation referendum, could lead to a whole bunch of fun stuff.
Premier Kenney seemed quite excited with the fact that the Alberta Court of Appeal sided with him and the fact that the carbon tax was unconstitutional. The province has demanded that it gets lifted ASAP. So what's next, Tyler? The Supreme Court?
Yeah, that's right. So this was a reference case, meaning the Alberta government said, look, Court of Appeals, tell us whether or not you think this is constitutional. So it wasn't a direct lawsuit in the way that these things are often talked about. So yeah, they said 4-1 decision, probably unconstitutional. This tramples all over the toes of the provinces. Now there have been other carbon tax cases ongoing. So the Alberta Court of Appeal said, yep, unconstitutional. You look over in Saskatchewan and Ontario, the courts there said, no, it's constitutional. So yes, this is going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will be the final arbiter on the constitutionality of the Greenhouse Gas and Pollution Act, or whatever the specific name is. It's come in one ear and out the other. So that's what will happen next. Now, as you say, the Alberta government has gone to the feds and said, oh, our court said this is unconstitutional. You should lift the tax on us right now. I'm not super confident the federal government is about to do that, or lift it until the Supreme Court makes a decision or something like that. But the good news on that front for Albertans is that tax season is coming up, and we will get rebates this year on the share of the carbon tax we've been paying.
I'm just wondering too, let's say if the Supreme Court of Canada sides with the Alberta government saying, you're right, it was unconstitutional, are we going to see like mega rebates then to all Canadians who pay this carbon tax over the years? You know?
That's a great question, and I mean, I could use a cash deposit in my
Yeah,
pocket
that's
about
right.
now, I'd say.
I think we all could, you're right. The province has invested millions of dollars into some pretty big capital projects, including $100 million for the Red Deer Regional Hospital and some big bucks into Calgary's Glenbow Museum.
That's right. So there have been a handful of sort of pre-budget announcements, and those are the two sort of big ones this week that we've been keeping an eye on. The loser, it seems at the moment, in some of these capital announcements has actually been Southern Alberta. There hasn't been much going on. I put in a call this week to the government and went through some of the old news releases to say, what are people in Lethbridge getting? What are people in Medicine Hat getting? And it's been rather quiet on that front, I would say. But you're right; they're doing the rounds a little bit. Have been doing the rounds, I should say, with some funding announcements. Because part of what Jason Kenney's been trying to telegraph regarding the budget and in the weeks leading up to the budget was that the easiest way to reach budgetary balance would be to just massively cut capital spending, and they don't especially want to do that, and they don't want it to look like they're doing that. So that is, I think, part of the reason why you are seeing some of these smaller announcements in the weeks leading up to the budget.
The government is also committing $3.4 million to support child advocacy centres for regions like Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, and Grand Prairie. And funding apparently will also be set aside for centres here in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat should they become operational.
That's correct. So there you go. There's the thing that seems to have come out in the last few weeks for Southern Alberta. Now, these child advocacy centers have previously operated on annual grants. So the idea now is that there's going to be this 3-year grant cycle that is going to sort of allow for more stable, more long-term funding and planning. So that's been, received quite well by some of the people operating these facilities. But yes, it's for Edmonton and Calgary, Grand Prairie, Lloydminster, I think, Red Deer. And so, yes, the funding is set aside should these centers open in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. So if anyone's, considering that down there, that's there's money on the table for it.
Tyler, the government of Alberta is also giving easier, more affordable access to dispute resolution services to mobile home site residents and landlords. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so there is a tenancy disagreement body that adjudicates disagreements between landlords and tenants. And up until now, if you lived in a mobile home and had a dispute with your landlord, you basically had to go to court. And so what that looked like was you'd bigger fees mainly to go to court. And so what this change does is allows those who live in mobile homes, who rent mobile homes, to use this dispute resolution board where the fee's like $75, I think. It's a few months wait still to get through. Unless it's urgent, then you can get heard in 25 days. This body's been around since about 2006, I think. Here's some 10,000 cases a year. And I believe the government is going to sort of continue looking as well at more of the sort of tenancy conditions for people who are in mobile homes. So, we are early days, really early days, only a few days into this new session of the legislature, and we're seeing some of these bigger things. Kenny talking about investing in the oil and gas industry. We're seeing some of these smaller things, which affects the lives of many everyday Albertans.
The Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me once again from Edmonton. Thanks again, Tyler.
My pleasure.